And I'm Claude Werder. I'm a principal analyst here at Brandon Hall Group. I'll be kicking things off for us today. And joining me today are three super experts from our sponsor, BTS, a consultancy specializing in the people side of strategy. And we welcome today Lynn Collins, who's head of development assessment solutions for BTS. Lynn's responsible for the development and expansion of the US assessment practice at BTS. And she brings extensive experience in individual and group assessment for development and selection, leadership competency studies, assessment and feedback delivery, and developmental action planning. And we have Lisa Sprinkle-Jones, succession and executive advisor for BTS. And she works closely with boards and senior leaders to align leadership needs with strategy, identify gaps, and implement a process to ensure the right leadership is in place. Lisa partners with clients ranging from nonprofits to global Fortune 100 companies to develop outstanding leaders and effective teams for positive organizational impact. And Sarah Woods, Senior VP and partner and head of office for BTS Boston, a practice that improves performance through communicative relationships and provides advisory and consulting to boards, CEOs, and their teams. Sarah provides oversight for the Boston office and BTS's business targets. And on the next slide, I just want to take a couple minutes to thank BTS for sponsoring today's webinar. You know, for over 3 decades, they've been designing powerful experiences that have a profound and lasting impact on businesses and their people. BTS helps the world's leading companies turn strategy into results. Their next generation approach combines deep business knowledge with transformational development to help your people and your company evolve together. BTS equips leaders for tomorrow by inspiring new ways of thinking, and they build critical capabilities and make strategy personal. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Brandon Hall Group, we're a human capital management research and analyst firm. We empower excellence in organizations around the world through our research and tools. Wanted to quickly mention to you that we have certification programs. Several are open for enrollment now, including our Certified Learning Strategist and Certified Leadership Development Strategist programs. Visit certification.brandonhall.com to learn more about how to earn that designation. Now, your participation in our surveys is a crucial component of our research. So if you have a few minutes to spare and see any topics here that you can take a survey for, it would be greatly appreciated. Links will be available in your handout, or you can just visit brandonhall.com. All participants in the surveys receive a complimentary piece of research. And finally, a few logistics before we get started. We welcome and really encourage your participation in our session today. To ask questions, you can use the panel on your control bar toward the bottom. Today's presentation is being recorded, and we'll share a link to the recording and a PDF of the presentation via email in roughly 24 hours. But if you want to download a copy of today's PDF of today's presentation instantly, the link to do so will be available in the chat in a few minutes. So just hang on for a few minutes and it'll be available in the chat. Chat is also great for joining in on today's discussion and sharing your thoughts as we go along. We'll be prompting you from time to time during the discussion to either ask us questions or give us your thoughts, and we'll have a couple of polls as well. Or you can just simply pop in, say hello, let us know where you're accessing the webinar from today, and we look forward to engaging hopefully during the webinar. So now let's go ahead and get started. So the purpose of the webinar, we really want to provide you with cutting edge thinking on succession management and provide insights to guide your journey. You know, succession is a broad topic and one that most organizations really struggle with. There are many definitions, many approaches. Some look at succession planning only for the CEO or C-suite and for maybe replacing high-level leaders simply when they depart. Others believe there must be short-term, mid-term, long-term succession planning at different levels of the organization. It's a complex and often a divisive topic in some organizations, we found. And so our mission today is to provide you with best-in-class thinking to define what it looks like when succession planning is working really the way it should. And given that we only have about an hour together today, we're going to focus primarily on senior level and executive succession, but The principles that Sarah, Lynn, and Lisa discussed today are leading edge thinking that applies to all critical roles. So as we get started, again, we'd love to know what your concerns are about succession, what roles you're playing or will play in succession. It's great for our team to get some understanding of where you're coming from when it comes to succession. It helps us as we go along in the presentation. So as you're doing that, and we hope you will contribute and just let us know a little bit about yourselves, we'll move on to trends in succession planning. So on the next slide, actually jump one more. Yeah, so Brandon Hall Group does research in leadership development every year. And this includes looking at succession planning. So when we ask about important elements of leadership development, succession management and planning rank toward the top of the list in terms of importance. But until recently, that importance has not translated into actual investment in terms of time and money. So 5 years ago, as this graphic shows, only 27% of organizations said they were investing heavily or moderately in succession planning in terms of time and money. 5 years later, after the COVID pandemic, generational shifts, the Great Resignation, and any of the other things we've all been dealing with, now almost half of organizations, 47%, say they're going to invest heavily or moderately in succession planning in 2023. So that's a 74% jump in focus on succession planning in a 5-year period. Now, moving on to the next slide, but just investing in succession management is not enough. Succession requires a different approach than most organizations have traditionally taken. There's a real business risk in not being prepared for leadership change. On this graphic, you'll see that in its most recent Trends and Priorities survey, the National Association of Corporate Directors identified CEO succession planning as a key area of improvement. And BTS and Brandon Hall Group as well know from our work with corporate boards and leaders that this need for improvement extends well beyond the CEO role as well. So on the next slide, in Brandon Hall Group's research, 79% of organizations ranked improving C-suite succession planning as a top priority for leadership development over the next couple of years, citing in particular that current processes have not been effective in producing leaders capable of pushing their leaders or their organizations into the future. So before we start drilling down on this and get into the nitty-gritty and the strategies for success, this triggers our first poll question for you that we'd like you to weigh in on. And it's a pretty straightforward question. Alexa will launch the poll, and it's: how effective are you or your organization in ensuring key talent can move successfully into high-level roles? Are you world-class or pretty effective? Okay, but needing some improvement? You struggle, or you're not at all effective? So take a couple of minutes. We're always interested to see where people sit, and that helps our team understand your experience and tailor their remarks as we go a little bit. Alexa can let us know when we've got some results to share. So nobody is world-class, but that's okay. Nobody really is, so you're in good company. About 66, about 2/3 of our folks say that they're pretty effective or okay, but needing improvement. And we've got about 34% that either struggle or really don't think they're effective at all. So we're here to help. And what we'll do now is move right into transforming succession management into a strategic strength, and I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Claude. Actually, you can jump on to the next slide, actually.
Yep, sorry.
That's okay. No, all good.
One more.
One more would be great. Yeah, thank you. So this really is a way for us to illustrate something that we've been experiencing quite a bit, which is that as Claude mentioned, succession planning is emerging as a top priority for company boards in all sectors. Because executive turnover is at an all-time high. And there's a lot of environmental factors around that, which you all know well. But traditional boards, whether they are public or private companies, they're not experts on succession. And so they rely heavily on management to create the strategies and the structures that protect the business long term and de-risk the company's evaluation. So when management and their HR organizations aren't really doing this well, it obviously means the risks get even higher. So that's the purpose of this webinar today, is to give you some very tactical and tangible ways to improve on your succession practices. When we talk to boards and CEOs, the quotes you see here reflect their fears that what they don't know could open the company to costly mistakes. So we hear things like, we wish we had better information, more data, a better process. We need to understand the bench more deeply. We have a name and an envelope, but we don't really know who else we have. So that's something that really starts at the top of the company. And Lynn, I think that's not just restricted to boards, right? We hear that from executives as well. And Lynn, you're on mute.
Yikes, folks, sorry. That's always fun. You are so right, Sarah. We only don't, it's not only heard from boards, we hear the pain points from executives. And if we can move to the next slide, look, research shows that we don't have the bench strength and people promoted don't have the talents we need, right? Happens all the time. We know that. And we know that executives tell us that they really can't agree on readiness and potential, right? They have disagreements, they have different standards, they have different expectations. And many times, unfortunately, succession can become quite political. I've heard things from executives saying, well, if you know the CEO, you're in, right? And one of my clients actually said, you know what, prior to your processes, successes were identified by the loudest, most influential voice in the room, right? Not necessarily the person who is actually the right person. The other pain point is many times leaders say it's really hard to compare people. They come from such different areas of the business. Perhaps someone coming from the commercial side versus the HR side. And how do I compare people? Some executives believe they know it when they see it, but there's plenty of research out there that gut instincts are terribly wrong. So, and the last point we hear is executives tend to look for leaders like themselves, right? We like to look for people who are clones of ourselves, and that significantly gets in the way of our diversity agenda, right? So how do we look for those unicorns? How do we look for that unique talent and making sure they're the right people? So we're actually wondering if some of this resonates for you. And Claude, I'll turn it back to you to kind of see where our participants here today are.
Great. If you can move to the next slide. And Alexa, I think our audience is not able to connect with us on the chat. If you can try to fix that so that they can provide comments and questions. At least it's not showing up on mine. So as we do that, let's take a look at this poll question, which is, which of the following would you say is the biggest barrier to improving succession planning in your organizations? And we give you three choices. It might be more than one of these, but we'd like you to pick one of these: either too many competing initiatives for executives to navigate, executives' lack of trust in HR processes, too many competing priorities in HR. And if none of those rung true, you can select other, and then hopefully, as we, I think now the chat is working, you can share in the chat some other barrier that might be impacting you. Yes, people are looking for the slides. Now that the chat is open, I will provide the link for you. Just bear with me. Okay, let's take a look at the results. And they are. So 35% say that there are too many competing initiatives. We have about 20% saying executive lack trust in the HR process. Another 35%, too many competing priorities in HR. And about 11% other. And we'll take a look at the chat and see what some of those are. So let's continue now as we move along.
All right, thank you. So where do you start? I see a lot of comments of, do we even know what we're supposed to assess? Or do we even know what the common criteria is? And it is difficult to get your arms around of, all right, it seems like such a big process. How do we break this down? And how do we really make sure that we have a foolproof process? And so we really want to encourage you to think about starting at this intersection of, you have a very unique culture. You don't just have any other one's culture that you could add in their competencies or their leadership framework or what's important for their leaders. You're looking at what's unique for your culture and what's unique about your future strategy. And we all know that COVID has changed different strategies. Your organization may not be the same organization it was just 2, 3, 4 years ago. And as you're looking at how your strategy has changed, what's the impact on your business model? What's the impact on the leadership capabilities that you need as well? So taking a look at what the future looks like, what your unique culture looks like, and using that to form the basis of where you start looking at what you need in your leaders. If we look at the next slide on how do you drill down on this, see if you can advance the slide here. There we go. Like people have said in the chat, first thing to do is identify what is your future ready success framework. And there was another Brandon Hall research that showed that 84% of participants identified that leveraging and aligning a consistent leadership model across the enterprise was one of their priorities for the next 2 years. So 84% of people believe that there's no alignment on what the leadership model looks like, the leadership framework looks like. And so we all know it's hard to identify and assess if we don't have alignment on what that is. So where is the enterprise going? What's a priority? What's a future strategy? How are we looking 3 to 5 years down the road versus looking at what we need right now? So gaining that alignment on the future ready success framework is where to start. And then, and only then, do you move on to the next section then, and Lynn will talk a little bit more in depth about this, is how do we even get the right talent into the candidate pool, and then what are we assessing them on? And oftentimes, this is where we stop. Oftentimes this is where we congratulate ourselves, we have alignment on a model, we've assessed people, and either we're too exhausted to move forward or we feel that this is the end. But there's almost an imaginary line here between this and then the next section, the preparing to succeed. So it's hard not to stop right here, but moving on to the third section here is really preparing that person to succeed. And so honestly, it is hard to get to this point. Again, congratulate yourself when you get to the point to prepare to succeed. But as our friends in the UK say, stay calm, carry on. This is where you need to keep carrying the torch and ensuring that we're preparing people both individually and as groups to succeed. And then there's almost an invisible line here between the fourth section here too, the ensuring success, is how do you transition people into that new role? So what about the role that they vacated? What about helping that person transition into that role? That just because they're there doesn't mean they're going to be successful. So how do we put all those things together? And on the next slide, I just want to drill down a bit more on the Future Ready Success Framework of what does this look like and how do you make it uniquely yours? Again, we can't emphasize enough the alignment to your strategy, putting it in business terms, putting it in terms that your leaders will gravitate towards and understand, looking at your culture, maybe doing a SWOT analysis, Digital has become definitely in the forefront. AI is a chatbot. I'm still confused about the whole group chatbot, but I believe it's chatbot AI that I'm hearing a lot about as well. So how do some of these trends, I mean, we have the banking crisis right now as well. So a lot of clients in financial services have a lot of market dynamics and disruptors. So thinking about how all of these things will impact what you need in your leaders and using those as your differentiators of having those market and role differentiators, having those leadership success factors, aligning it back to your culture and values, and really how do you define leadership for your organization. And Lynn, I'm going to turn it over to you now to talk a little bit more about, all right, we hopefully have an aligned framework. Now what?
Yeah, now that we have that framework, how do we ensure that we have the talent we need to meet today's and tomorrow's challenges, right? So we need insights on these people, right? We want to know who the talent is, who's emerging, who's ready now, and of course, how are we going to accelerate their growth? And really, one of the biggest trends in our research is on the overall practice of succession is all around the multi-method approach to assessment. We know using the multi-method approach, it's based on 50 years of research, and it demonstrates superior accuracy on predicting success. So why? Because it's a comprehensive and full picture of the individual. And if you use multiple methods, each tool provides unique insights about a participant's ability. So we could look at how leaders perform at work, what leaders are capable of doing, how leaders see themselves, how others see them, how are they inspiring, engaging, motivating others. And as part of this approach, the most unbiased way to assess readiness is also having a simulation. Why? Imagine we put people in the actual job. That provides everybody the unique opportunity to demonstrate their skills, right? If we don't put them in the job, we might not have an opportunity to see those skills otherwise. So once you put them through, you've identified your candidates, and that we do in combination with our organizations, because it all depends on that success profile. So we have to identify who can live into the future and lead us in senior leadership positions. We then put them through a multi-method approach. We have insights on each individual. What are their strengths? What are their development opportunities? What can we help them develop? What is the time span for development, depending on the areas they need to develop? What are the gaps? And that helps us understand not only the individual, but sometimes we're looking at many individuals, right? There are several people who can move into a critical role. So how do we understand that bench strength? And how do we help the cohort? How do we help our people lead into the future? And one of the things I say very frequently is assessment without development is like diagnosis without treatment, right? So we've done the assessment, it doesn't stop there. That is where organizations fail. So let's kind of learn what happens from here, and Sarah, I'll pass it over to you.
Great. Yeah, I mean, many, many leaders tell us, and you probably have experienced this too in your work, that they've gone through several rounds of different types of assessments throughout the course of their careers. And particularly if they're up at a very executive level and they have a C-level opportunity, by the time they've reached that point in their careers, many of them have experienced different types of assessments and feedback, or they've gotten a report. But because those sometimes can just get delivered to the executive and they're left to their own devices to figure out what to do with that information, they don't really remember what the report said or how they were using it when they tried to get into the next area of development. So it's a big missed opportunity to provide assessment and some sort of insight without action. And we know that practical action is critical to growth. So once leaders have received the well-designed assessment that Lynn was just describing, which is much more comprehensive than, say, running a single self-assessment or a psychometric and then having them try to read it and understand it, move to a structured development plan, supported both organizationally and with the right level of external support. When we work in coaching and advisory, one-on-one coaching and advisory relationships with leaders, the development roadmap is structured to engage internal partners who can support the growth of the leader through the internal structures and systems that exist, and also a roadmap that has goals that align with the business needs of that leader in their potential future role. So again, going back to Lisa's point, it all starts with building a leadership framework that sets criteria for succession that's designed in a future state. So where is our company going? What's the environment? What are we trying to do competitively? What are we trying to distinguish ourselves as in our markets? And combined with a culture, then a criteria is defined that you can use assessment to evaluate the leaders against that criteria. But once they have that, then they need to leverage their strengths and develop those areas where they need to be stronger based on that criteria. So we would advocate that you ensure that they are given every opportunity to grow into the leadership that the company will need going forward. And then if we go to the next slide, what we don't want to do is say that getting the new role is the finish line. Because once we've gotten those leaders into a position to be able to be candidates or to be ready next successors for a particular role, that's actually where the work begins. Because when they are brought into a new role, the more senior they are, the higher the stakes are for them, because their span of control is greater and their breadth of impact is greater. For C-suite level leaders, their exposure is extremely high because of the broad set of stakeholders that they have, including not only their organizations, but many of them will have new peers. They'll be working within a new team, and they need to learn to work with that team in a more effective way. They'll have often exposure to external clients or external markets, such as analysts, particularly in senior roles. The board of directors may now be somebody that they're interfacing with. So for the CEO who's placed in a new role, someone who's succeeded into the CEO role, they set the narrative for the entire company and culture, and the mic is always on. A single phrase or word can move the stock or shake employee engagement or the confidence of the organization. So, it's critical that they are given a strong partner who provides a safe zone to work through their decisions and their communications. And what we've laid out here on this slide is a common framework we use for the first year in a C-level role and the second year in a C-level role, how we would work to support their objectives and the ways that they grow into those roles. And then on the next slide, a way to think about this is some of the very common shifts that we know are critical when moving up into very senior levels or executive levels in organizations. And you've probably found this to be true as well, that leaders who have been very strong in their function or very strong in a business line, you're wanting to give them experiences that help them get exposed to different areas of the business or different areas of expertise within the business. Because ultimately, where they're going to be going as they grow in the organization is into seeing and understanding the whole enterprise. And so making that mindset shift in any development you provide for them from functional or business level role or expertise into enterprise role is probably the most essential thing you can be providing them with. Because while they may also have been operationally focused or very focused on execution within their organization, and frankly, were very confident about the decisions they were making in that role because they understood their area of expertise so well and were being measured and valued and rewarded based on that area of expertise, will shift dramatically as they get up into this C-level, because they now need to set a different vision for their organization and lead in a very different way and align teams differently to be able to grapple with conflicting priorities and be able to make decisions across the enterprise in a really different way. And to do that, they'll need to foster debate and constructive dialogue that allows them to consider scenarios, consider the planning that would have to go into it, and make some of the tough decisions on behalf of the organization. So this is just an example of those critical shifts in mindset that we see happen as leaders are preparing to succeed into very senior roles. So Claude, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Yes, we've been getting a lot of great comments and mostly discussion on the 9-box and what organizations are doing. And we thought it might be good to address some of those comments and invite you to ask questions of where, on things we've covered so far before we move into the case study. So I know we've gotten a few different comments on whether people are using the 9-box or an alternate to the 9-box or 9-box at all, stopping the 9-box and using just conversation. So I wonder what our experts feel and what they see some of the trends, and then maybe we can get some more comments from the audience.
Yeah, and Claude, I believe somebody had a raised hand as well.
Okay, I'm not seeing that. Maybe Alexa, you can help me.
Sounds good. Yeah, I was watching the comments on the 9-box, and it seems like some, I haven't read them deeply because I was more in the webinar, but my brief look at them, that some are using it and some have moved away from it. My experience is I'm seeing more and more organizations moving away from it because, it's not as simple to put talent into 9 boxes. And I'm seeing more and more organizations committing time to really deeply understanding the talent. But I'm curious from my other panelists and from those of you who want to participate who are listening.
Are people able to come off mute to talk or just in the comments?
Just in the comments.
Okay.
Oh, thank you for sharing that.
Any others?
To Lynn's point, I do see people moving away from the 9-box, and when you're using the multi-assessments, you have more inputs, and sometimes they might weight those more heavily than other inputs. But what I think was novel about the 9-box when it first came out was the performance and potential was the potential, and that we hadn't always talked about future potential as we do now. Simulations, for example, are a way to look at that future potential and how people are performing now and how they might perform in the next level as well. So I think it really goes back to, again, what are you assessing on? And then what are the different inputs, and having good conversations around those inputs and the development needs that people have to move on to that next level.
And I would agree. I agree with Julia, who put into the chat that there's too much emphasis on who goes into the boxes and not enough discussion about preparing them for the roles that they'll need to take on next. And so I think that a more comprehensive way of thinking about talent's readiness and potential is what we're all looking for and all recommending. And yeah. Our hope is that by describing a process, Brent had also asked, though Brent, I would recommend put your comments into the everyone chat as opposed to the host and panelist chat, and you'll probably get more responses. But you had asked, what do businesses use then? What are people using that they're finding as handy and easy? The reason a lot of clients we work with use 9box is because it's pretty straightforward, right? It gives you an organizational tool. It gives you a framework to use. And you're right, it's a little bit more work to build something that's relevant. Remember, start at the intersection of your culture and the strategy that your company is trying to drive. It means that you'll need to get close to the strategy of the company. You know, you probably feel as though you've got good information or good data around your culture. And sometimes it's harder to engage the business leaders in a conversation about the future strategy and what the implications would be for the human capital strategy. But that's what's essential in creating an alternative to the 9box that will be successful for your company.
We're getting some good messages here. Sarah Jackson talked about that they're going with getting away from it and focusing more on potential. And a couple of others talked about using different models. And one of the things that I just wanted to point out too is our research shows that organizations want to focus also more on aspiration. Yes. and that the 9box really doesn't get to that, and that the aspiration, especially with the new generation of the workforce, is almost as important as their ability and their capabilities, because they have to be wanting to be in that role. They might have a lot of capability, but they may not want to be maybe where the organization thinks they should be, and so there needs to be that alignment. So more discussion.
Yeah, Claude, I'm going to double click on that. Our research also shows the same thing, that aspiration and inspiration is so important, needs to be accounted for. Also, we have a 5-factor model based on our research, which speaks to self-awareness, leadership maturity, inspiration, aspiration. We found business acumen is critical. People acumen is critical. And then going back to the success profile Lisa spoke about, there's that X factor. Many organizations are going through some kind of shift, transformation, culture change, innovation, and identifying what is critical to inform that strategy. So those become really important.
Yeah, some great comments, and we can continue the discussion in a few minutes. And also, I'll use this time to just remind people if there's any other questions you have about this or anything else, to put them in the Q&A, and we'll handle that toward the end. But we want to move now on to some real life examples of really good succession planning, succession management in action.
Yeah, and to Sarah's point, we can certainly share those 5 factors that Lynn mentioned about potential and the aspiration. I think we could have some really great conversations too. And Claude, you might want to do another webinar on 9box alternatives. It sounds like there's a lot of discussion, a lot of need for what is an alternative. I mean, a lot of it's around the conversations that you have, but how do you foster those good conversations? I wanted to take a few minutes and just share a case study of an example of getting that future ready success profile right and how important it is. This is an example. This is from a financial services organization where they knew that they needed to transition the CEO. He was moving into the chairman role. They had quite a few years runway, but there was no alignment on what that future ready profile looked like, what the next CEO needed to do, especially since the CEO had been there for so many years and was quite iconic in his ideas and what he wanted to do. And so the board wasn't clear, do we need someone internal? Do we need someone external? And wanted an objective viewpoint on what do we really need? We've been too insular, we need to have somebody else help us. So through the process, we identified what that success profile would look like. Also help the board and the succession planning committee really think through what our best practices, how do you support the person internally or externally, And then also, how do you develop the bench strength under that? Because not only did they realize that the CEO, that there really wasn't a great profile for the CEO or alignment, there was an alignment on the next level as well. So taking that model down to the next level and exploring what does that mean for the entire C-suite and for that entire team. So through the process, they finally felt like they had confidence in selecting, which turned out to be an internal candidate, selecting that internal candidate. And on the next slide, it just shows a snapshot of our process, because in addition to the succession planning framework and identifying what this profile looked like, we first looked internally, but we partnered with an external search firm if we did need to go external. And the external search firm helped us validate the model that, all right, this profile that we're creating exists someplace in the world, either externally or internally, but they did not need to move to external. An internal candidate was selected, but there's a lot of support around that individual, and also a lot of support around that individual's team. So coaching and advisory to ensure that success, taking a look at the team as a whole and what some of the strengths are and where that team needed to do differently, and taking a look at some of those gaps. And then on the next slide, just a quick snapshot of what that leadership profile looked like for the C-suite. So below, we talked about gaining alignment, and it's almost as important what you include and what you don't include and the messages that it sends. I mean, obviously, when you're looking at a leadership framework, everything sounds important, everything sounds interesting, but really distilling it down to, especially for this organization, their culture in terms of being a culture enabler and also sustaining the world-class reputation that they had. Those were things that might be different than you might find in another organization. So what's your secret sauce, and what do you need to have within your own organization that makes it different, but that also clarifies this is what we're looking for, and this is what we're assessing people for as well. Sarah, anything I missed on that would be important to articulate before we move to the key takeaways?
No, I think you summed it up really nicely, but the only thing I would add is how important it was to the succession committee of the board of directors to have good hygiene and a good process to follow when they were thinking about their number one job, which is the succession of the CEO. And not just the immediate succession, but the 3 to 5 year planning around succession of the CEO. So this enabled both the board as well as management to align and to be really all on the same page about what it was going to take. But I think you did a great job describing it. And if we can go on to the next slide. We thought we would maybe share with you some practical things you can start to think about doing organizationally. We won't give these to you all in bullet points. You'll have this in the link that you can use as a takeaway, but just thought we would summarize these. But as I'm going to summarize them, but as I do, I'd love to get your thoughts in the chat about additional, just some wisdom sharing on how you've addressed some of these core areas of succession planning. And when we say succession planning, we're really not referencing emergency succession or replacement planning, but truly planning a pipeline and a strong bench of ready next successors. So some things that you can do, particularly for the Future Ready Success Framework, is focus on the future strategy and engage and align leadership in the conversation. The best way you can do that is by simplifying the process and speaking in the language of business. I've been accused of, many of us have been accused of using jargon and using HR speak, and that's something that really, as you've probably sometimes experienced, can create a barrier in communication between the work that you're trying to do and the leadership's readiness to accept it or to engage in it and pick up that ball and do the work that they need to do. So speaking in the language of business, making it directly connect to their business strategy and keeping it simple and ready to use is probably the best way you're going to move the ball on building a framework that works well for your leadership. And I'm curious to hear if others have had success in other ways, so please add your thinking around that. Another what to do next on the candidate identification and readiness assessment is don't rely on a single assessment. As Lynn described, seeing the whole person, really evaluating their potential and their readiness for a next move or a big role should be done through a lot of different lenses into that person's ability to succeed culturally, create followership, execute successfully on the requirements of the role, and reflect the culture and leadership that the company is trying to aspire to. Those are really the essential elements you're trying to get to when you're looking at IDing readiness and assessment. And also make sure that you're highlighting both individual and group insights on readiness and gaps for the next role. And I'm also curious to hear best practices that you've used at your company, so please add those to the chat. If you go to the next slide, some other things to do next on preparing to succeed are take the risk out of promotion and succession by providing leaders with the right resources and plan of action to enable them to grow and to help them prepare themselves for their next role and to prepare the talent that will fill the role they leave. As we've talked about in this webinar, it's one thing to get folks ready to get into the next role, but that leaves a gap in the organization. And it happens at the most senior levels. We're working with a client right now who's the CFO of a publicly traded company who's just been identified as the next CEO. He has a year to get into the seat, and we're working to prepare him to succeed in that role. But all of a sudden, they realize the person they thought might take his role really isn't the right candidate when they looked at the fact that their market is changing, their competitive position in the market is changing, the recession is impacting them, interest rates are impacting them, and they need to go to the outside. So they had not thought that through. And so it's as relevant now in the most senior levels of the organization as it is all the way up the pipeline. So help them prepare for that. And then lastly, in ensuring success, as we've said, placement isn't the finish line. We know from executive turnover that even seasoned leaders face unexpected challenges. So plan to provide them with the right level of support and structure to take the risk out of the succession transition that they'll make. And when we look at C-level in years 1 and 2, that's largely ensuring that it's a low risk transition and onboarding because of the investment that the company makes either into the successor or into placement from the outside. And so getting it right is essential. So I'll invite more comments in the chat, and I'd also invite both Lisa and Lynn to add anything to the sort of next steps to take so that you have some takeaways from this webinar.
So there's a comment from Julia about being transparent with the successor and how other companies approach the transparency piece of succession. If anyone wants to weigh into that, we typically talk about making sure the process is very transparent. And so everyone knows what the criteria is, how you're being evaluated against that criteria, what development plans are with that criteria. But curious to hear other people's perspectives as well.
Yeah, I second that, Lisa. And I see that even more and more important today, right? As organizations have transformed and authentic leadership and transparency have become even more important. And I find that organizations are open to the transparency and very, what's the word? They pay much attention to, even if you're not that successor for the critical role, that we're going to put you in a very big, important position that speaks to your strengths.
Yeah, I'd echo that too. Transparency is critical right now in executive succession because of the trust that it builds in the process. If it feels as though folks are waiting around for the white or black smoke to go up the chimney, right? And who's been named, they actually don't have a lot of trust in how that successor was named. And we talked about that a little bit earlier, and some of you had even added that to the chat, that this sort of, who's the closest, who's in the inner circle, who was the system gamed in some way? Was it obvious who was going to get it? Really challenges cultural efforts around inclusion and diversity. And it's of essential importance that there's clear criteria, well understood by the organization, that starts with the framework that Lisa described. It has to be an inclusive process in building that framework. And as we all know, the pyramid gets narrower as you get closer to the top. And so there's always the question of whether or not key talent will stay if they don't get a promotion, et cetera. And our research has shown that more often they will stay if they trusted the process of promotion. If they felt that the criteria was fair, was transparent, they were given an opportunity to be assessed and evaluated in a comprehensive way, and that they were given every opportunity to be prepared to succeed. That's the secret to retention of key talent. So I would advocate that transparency in the process is a critical success factor in the future of good succession planning. So why don't we take a look at the next slide, which is really, what does it look like when good succession planning is working? If you have developed a strong set of criteria that evaluates the leaders of the future for your company, you have done it. Secondly, if you have a robust pipeline and real data, really valuable data on your leaders, you're doing it. And if everyone understands and trusts the process and knows the path and the development plan, you are best in class right now. Conversely, if there is a surprise and you've got a board member saying, we got to call a recruiter, you know you're not doing it right. So I would say these are going to be your 3 KPIs around success in succession planning.
Well, great. I think we have a little time for some questions. So there's a few comments that have been coming in that we'll answer. And then if you have any other questions over the next few minutes, just put them in the QA or in chat. So Stephanie just asked if there's anything you can share, this is probably for you, Lynn, about the development centers you have built for assessing talent through simulations.
Wow. So how much time do we have?
Lynn can talk about this a long time.
This is exactly, the space I love and I've worked in for over 30 years. But Stephanie, really on a short story, we really custom build simulations. So we find out, going back to what's the strategy, what's the culture, what's going to get you there, right? And we will custom build simulations. More generally than that, we truly believe that business acumen and people acumen are really key to success. So our simulations generally include a business, we call it a business acumen assessment, where actually individuals get to play the CEO for a company. And we actually go through 3 cycles representing 3 years and have them run the company, making key decisions about where to invest money, what markets are we entering, what about our employees, what about our people, and how are they responding to all the decisions we make. So generally we'll include that in an assessment center. We'll also include individual role plays around pivotal moments, like what is key to success, right? So for one of our clients, what was most key was, town hall presentations. It was most key getting people aligned with a brand new strategy, right? So we'll simulate all those types of things that are going on. I hope that helps, because I probably could go on and on, but I'll pause there.
To say it's quite rigorous and sophisticated. We had to go through it as participants, and I was a little surprised, like how difficult it was and how much it showed what I needed to learn, and what were the next steps there.
Yeah, Lisa, thank you for that. I mean, really what we find is people thank us, because it's not only our ability to observe people enroll, and we say catch people in the act of being themselves, it's also the individual's ability to say, you know what, I can see that was a gap for me. And there's a great deal of self-insight, and the high fidelity creates buy-in towards, I get this, and this is right, and this is what I need to work on.
If there's any more information, Lynn, that you can put in the chat, maybe a place where people can go. We've got a couple of people asking for more information. And I want to get in the just the last couple of minutes, this question. I think it's from Julia, different Julia. Curious how organizations go about identifying critical roles in the organization beyond senior leadership. One challenge is, despite having a definition for leaders to use for identification, we find people are interpreting it differently. And there's a lot of back and forth between HR, leaders, senior leaders to fine tune which roles are truly critical. Wonder if anybody can shed some light on that.
Lynn, do you want to take that?
To how to identify which roles are absolutely critical. I was trying to put in the chat. So organizations struggle with this, truth be told. And many times my experience has been, we work with the organization and we help them define which roles are critical. It could be anything from span a role, impact a role, revenue a role. It really depends on the organization, or risk a role, right? Sometimes critical role is we know that people are, that person is going to leave, and we have to set somebody up for success. And sometimes it's more general, as it's, a general manager role is typically one of the most critical roles that are identified as needed, successors to take over, because they're like CEOs, but they're CEOs of their own businesses. So I really, sorry to hit you with it depends, but we'll work with the organization to identify exactly what those criteria are. Sarah, Lisa?
I was to say, go back to, what we talked about, creating those success profiles, of looking at the SWOT analysis, where does your organization need to go in the future, and see how that can help with your workforce planning and helping identify those critical roles. Oftentimes we see those as more like candidate pools for those roles as well, and it's a little bit more widespread. It could be more 2 to 3, 3 to 5, 7 to 10. People start looking farther and farther out when they're developing in some of those key roles.
Last call for any quick questions or final comments before we sign off today. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, taking your time. We know you have a lot of work to do, a lot of different ways you can spend your time to gain insight and learning, and we appreciate you coming to us today. Thank you once again to BTS and Lynn, Sarah, and Lisa. Great job, and we think this is a great conversation. Hopefully it's a conversation that can be continued as well, and we'll be looking at the chat and perhaps following up with some of the people. So thank you for your participation. Thank you to BTS. And we look forward to seeing many of you on another Brandon Hall Group webinar in the near future. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Bye.